Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Thompson. He holds appointments as professor in the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology and the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto in Canada. He has published extensively on evolutionary theory, population genetics, mathematical modeling in biology, theory structure in biology, philosophy of medicine, and ethics. And today we're going to focus on his book, Evolution, Morality, and the Fabric of Society. So, Dr. Thompson, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, in the book, you focus or basically approach morality from the perspective of a social contract theory. So, what is that?
Social contract theory has a number of different forms, but the essential element is that societies are organized and made to function well under a social contract. Sometimes that contract is explicit, as you would find in constitutions of countries where they've spelled out some of the basic ground rules of that country's social structure. In other cases, they're very informal, excuse me, such as you'd find in pre-literate, pre-industrial societies 5,000 years ago, and their structures were just understood. They were smaller groups usually. Some societies have understood but not written down social contracts. The UK is an example of that. And some countries don't even have a clear sense of what that social contract is, but they all operate under a set of rules and assumptions.
In what ways does that approach allow for us to understand the evolution of human morality?
Let me answer a little bit about the tradition of social contract theory, which started with Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, and had the form that I'm closer to in Rousseau during the French Revolution period, and was resurrected in the 20th century by John Rawls, a name that many people may have already heard. And that notion of social contract is a way of trying to derive morality by thinking about what rational, self-interested individuals would want in terms of the organization of society. So it's more of a thought experiment justifying morality by what kind of a world would people want to live in if they had their own self-interest at heart and they were rational. And everybody knows that you're going to have to make some compromises to get the best outcome for yourself. And so you would begin to trade off some of your potential freedoms and desires for other people satisfying theirs. The approach that I like comes more from Rousseau. Some people think that it also comes from Hume, but I'm less clear on that. And that is that it is not a rational exercise. It's something that over time developed. And you can see elements of it in non-human primates and in organisms in other species other than primates. And therefore, the social contract is a way in which we slowly began to organize behavior, in some cases directly as a result of the evolutionary advantage, and those that behaved in a certain way passed on that disposition to behave that way, and it became embedded in the population. And sometimes by a conscious decision when you get to the level of more cognitive abilities.
And would evolutionary reproductive success play a role here?
For me, it plays a crucial role because evolutionary reproductive success is what will hone the ability to cooperate and therefore to work together in a contractual sort of way. And in lower cognitive organisms, birds are a great example. the level of cooperation is low, but those who have cooperative instincts, let me call them, or propensities, are going to do better in the struggle for survival than those that don't. So birds that are prepared to give a call when there's danger, even though it puts them at a little danger, are more likely to be part of a group that survives than ones that don't. So even in relatively low cognitive organisms, you can see evolution at work, honing the ability of organisms to work together for the benefit of all.
Mm-hmm. Are mechanisms like kin selection and reciprocal altruism part of your account of human morality?
Yes, and in fact, they're critical. Kin selection is a powerful force, probably not the strongest force in what I am arguing has developed, has evolved. More likely, reciprocal altruism is the driving force. But kin selection means that you do better in the evolutionary struggle for survival if you help kin or they help you. And you can sometimes increase your own ability to pass your genes. This is a genetically based understanding. Place your genes into the next generation. If you help cousins, brothers, sisters, even parents who are going to have more offspring, because the relatedness between the individuals is quite strong. So the genetics that are shared are high. And therefore, when you help a brother to have offspring or a sister to have more offspring, you're actually putting some of your genes in the next generation because you share them with your brother and sister. Reciprocal altruism is a kind of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. So it's a way of cooperating with somebody in order to get an advantage for yourself, but it obviously delivers an advantage for them. And this is the beginnings of working together in a cooperative way that then leads to implicit contracts and maybe later explicit contracts of how you're going to help each other. And there's nice examples from a mathematical area called game theory, where you can put individuals in situations where they can cooperate or they can defect. And the game is set up in a way that cooperators do better than those that end up defecting. If you are a cooperator and someone defects on you, you do the worst of all. So you don't want to be dealing with people who are known defectors. So on a one-shot deal in a game, you're probably not going to know enough to know whether to defect or not. But if you have to do it over and over again, especially with the same people, you get to know who's trustworthy and who isn't. And trustworthiness and keeping one's promises is an important part of the development of an implicit cooperative structure and an implicit social contract.
Do you think we already have a full evolutionary account of human sociality, how it evolved, and particularly aspects pertaining to human cooperation?
Do we have a strong picture? We have a decent enough picture to enable us to get the major threads, and I would suggest get an accurate assessment of the various steps in the development of our cooperative cooperation and sociality. Is there a lot more to be learned? There's always a lot more to be learned. And whether we are, in some cases, speculating where we think we have more information than we do, I suspect that happens in every field, and evolutionary dynamics and evolution in general is going to be no exception. So we always make leaps on the basis of data, and it's up to the community of scholars to keep correcting others who make jumps that seem not terribly helpful or certainly not terribly accurate.
Mhm. Does rational deliberation also play a role in your account of social contract theory or not?
Yes, but unlike the social contractarians that, and here I would put Hobbes, and in the current climate, David Gautier as a philosopher who's advocated, and John Rawls as well, they believe that morality is generated by rational discourse and rational deliberation. The view that I'm proposing says that rationality came very late in the process, and most of the cooperative tendencies and most of our social contract impulses came from our evolved propensities, a lot of midbrain kind of activity that was honed by evolution. And rationality helps us to do a number of things. One, to understand that, but also to hone it and correct it for a different kind of environment than the one in which we evolved. So one example that I use in the book is xenophobia. We have a propensity to be xenophobic, to be wary, at a minimum, wary of people outside of our own social group. This served us well in times when we were local tribes and resources were scarce and you wanted to protect your own resource base, or you wanted to take somebody else's because yours was inadequate. It serves us very poorly in a global world. It certainly serves us poorly in large societies like the United States or Canada or Portugal, where there's enormous diversity, even if you leave aside immigration. I mean, my in-laws on my son's daughter, my daughter-in-law, my son's wife, is Portuguese. So I have a sort of sense of the diversity in regions of Portugal, just in language, in culture and behavior. So forget about immigration. Even within a large-scale state like Portugal, you're going to find a lot of differences. Xenophobia serves us poorly. It certainly is serving us poorly on the global stage these days, as far as I can tell. So that's where some rational intervention in our evolved propensities helps us to sustain a social contract, to sustain a functioning society that benefits us all. And it hones our cooperative landscape, using our propensity to be cooperative and then trying to erase as much as possible our propensity to be xenophobic. I think xenophobia is actually a pretty good example in the modern world.
Mm-hmm. So, in the book, at a certain point, you talk about three principles: inclusion, individual sovereignty or liberty, and equality. So, why do you focus on these three, and what would be the evolutionary rationale behind them?
Okay, the ultimate evolutionary rationale is evolutionary reproductive success. And I mean by that long-term reproductive success. So you can be successful in one generation, but that will have almost no evolutionary impact. Whatever characteristic you have that has made you successful in out-reproducing others who have a different genetic profile has to be sustained over time. One of the ways in which you can enhance your evolutionary reproductive success is to cooperate with other people. And that cooperation shows up mostly in reciprocal altruism, which you've mentioned already. We've spoken about a little bit in kin selection, in the way in which helping kin gives you a reproductive advantage. But reciprocity is one of the drivers for non-related individuals. Most of us are not related to each other, but have a propensity to help in order to benefit ourselves largely. This does create problems for people who want to preserve a standard notion of altruism, which is that people just do things out of the goodness of their heart, because this view says most of the time, I wouldn't rule that out as never happening, but most of the time there's an ulterior motive, and it has to do with your own success. Evolution trades on that ability to cooperate and have a genetic propensity to cooperate, and therefore enhance your ability to pass those cooperative genes on to the next generation. So once you've accepted, if you do, that cooperation is an evolved propensity designed to enhance reproductive success, to make us more successful, so it's self-interested at heart, then you can ask, well, what other things might also do that? What other propensities might do that are secondary, that aren't just as global as cooperation? And the answer there is that inclusion, that working together is better than marginalizing groups of people. Because as I say in the book, life is unpredictable, and you may now have some strengths that allow you and a few other people to cooperate and gang up on neighbors. But the tables may turn, and you may end up an invalid or having some other weakness. And now you're going to depend on that other group to help you. So it always benefits to be as broad in your cooperative reach as possible in bringing about your own self-interest. So that gets inclusion into the picture. Mm-hmm. And it's always the case that if you want to maximize your own self-interest, you want to be able to achieve as many of your own desires and interests as possible. And that means you want to maximize your liberty. But you want to maximize your liberty by recognizing that in a cooperative structure, other people want to do that too. And so, as Spencer nicely put it, you want to maximize your self-interest consistent with the similar maximization of the interests of other people. And that's the foundation of cooperation, which underpins this moral view that I'm putting forward. And then I think equality falls out as maybe it's really a third tier, but I've put it as a second tier, as equal to liberty and inclusiveness. But it falls out of liberty more than anything else. And you're not going to be have maximum liberty if you don't recognize the equality desires of other people and you don't treat them equally, because they won't treat you equally. And the cooperation will break down. So each of those three are really derivative. Whether it's a logical mathematical derivation, I'm not all that prepared to speculate on, but you can see the kind of derivation, at least it's an informal derivation based on our cooperative impulses, which are based on the advantages of cooperation to our long-term reproductive success.
But it's not the case that societies have to necessarily respect these principles for them to be, I mean, societies and individuals to be reproductively successful, right?
In the short term, people can be reproductively successful, perhaps even more reproductively successful, if they cheat, for example, or if they use their brute strength or their brain power to outwit somebody else. But in the long run, which is what rational self-interest aims for, it will break down. So go back to the example of game theory. If you keep repeating the game, people get wise to the fact that you're untrustworthy and you're going to defect if it advantages you the minute you see the advantage. So you get marginalized and become an outcast. And we do this all the time. We marginalize people who we don't think are playing the game, certainly not playing it the way we'd like it to be played, and are therefore poor cooperators. So in the long term, cooperation advantages you. In the short term, you might be able to get away with advantaging your reproductive success by going it alone or in a small group of people.
Right. In the book, you also talk about some social issues like patriarchy, copulatory choices, and individual liberty, and also overpopulation and extinction. So, starting with patriarchy, where does sexual inequality stem from to begin with?
I think you can see sexual inequality way down the evolutionary path. Whether you'd call it patriarchy is a different question, but the dance for control of mating is probably the main initial driver of what has come in primate societies and definitely in human societies to be patriarchal. And if you take a look at species outside of primates, you'll see that in many cases there is a jockeying between male and female as to which is going to control the reproductive dance. And in some cases, females do, and in many, many cases, males do. For males, there's a lot at stake because, and as you go up the evolutionary scale and more care is required for offspring, the more is at stake. So for males, it's not easy to know whether or not this is your offspring. Mm-hmm. Whereas for females, except in some very rare cases, very, very rare, the female will know that it's it's his or her offspring, rather.
Right.
So he may not know whether somebody has intervened, and especially given that estrus is not as predictable as males would like it to be, though interestingly, it's more predictable than we had believed until probably the last 40 years, where there's now all kinds of reasons, experimental evidence to suggest that we know when females are having their estrus cycle. We know when they're menstruating. Mm-hmm. And that's a part about humans, that patriarchy manifests itself in all the rules around menstruation, not really because it's a control issue or a paternity issue. It's that humans are rare in the animal world in menstruating. Most animals, the blood is reabsorbed. So you'd have to live in Africa where there are some other animals that menstruate in order to see this. So humans are different, and that has caused us to feel very differently about that process in human females. And patriarchy has just layered it with all kinds of special rules and taboos and so on. But estrus, which is largely hidden, that is when a woman is ovulating, a female in general, but in the case of humans, a woman is ovulating, that is much more detectable than we would have thought 100 years ago. There's, for example, a slight enlarging of the facial features. You call it bloating, but it's really not noticeable enough to call it bloating. There are odors that can be detected. Now, humans are very good at making a mess of all of our biological abilities by wearing perfumes and bathing, at least once a day, and some people twice a day. So we can eradicate some of these, but there is no question that females give off signals that they're in heat, they're having an estrus cycle. So going back to the question about the origins of patriarchy, I think it comes from that kind of control of the female and the offspring and knowing that it's yours. So in primates, you see that the male is very dominant, does control one or more females, fights off other males, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. In the case of humans, something interesting changed when language became available, because the collusion between males, and you see collusion among males in primates, and if anyone's really interested in following this through, Barbara Smuts' paper on the evolution of patriarchy is a wonderful paper, which is the citations in my book, where she goes through the various stages of male dominance of the sexual behavior of females, and then it becomes more generalized. Once we have language, males can collude more easily, and they can tell stories and come up with ideologies and mythologies, and begin to impose them. And that's how patriarchy arose because of mating issues, but then became a way of males having hegemony over all kinds of aspects of society, and especially of female behavior.
But can patriarchy damage evolutionary reproductive success in any way?
That's an interesting question, partly because I think the answer is divergent. For primates and other species than Homo sapiens, I would say that the patriarchy would be hard to eradicate and plays a significant role. And so I would be hard pressed to say it harms that particular level of species behavior. But in the case of humans, we have now, it's going back to xenophobia. I mean, we have so many ways cognitively. One of the things that I think you're going to ask me is about cognition and what I mean by what its role is, and we'll come to that. But cognitively, we're able to think about the way we behave and what propensities we have and whether they serve us well. And xenophobia serves us poorly, but so does patriarchy. And the argument that I develop is that patriarchy arose for the reasons I've given and took us up a particular evolutionary path to a point where it was advantageous. But now in a changed environment, the environment, I'd say, of even the last 1,000 years, but certainly in the last 100 years, the environment is sufficiently different, and patriarchy does not serve us well. And therefore it's suboptimal. And we need to go down the climb that we made to evolutionary benefit and begin to dismantle patriarchy the way we need to begin to dismantle xenophobia if we are going to continue to be able to cooperate and run societies. So patriarchy is beneficial under circumstances that evolution has functioned for many, well, not just millennia, but probably millions of years, but serves us very poorly now, and certainly within the last 100 years, and needs to be dismantled and rethought, and our propensities towards it and all the mythologies and ideologies we've constructed need to be dismantled.
So before we get into copulatory choices, since you mentioned cognition, tell us a little bit about it. So how do you understand cognition and the role it might play in mediating moral behavior?
Well, cognition for me is just the ability to think. And so cognition is not restricted to humans. Humans have higher cognition or cognitive capacities than other primates, and certainly than those in other species. I mean, octopods are, we know, much more intelligent than we would have ever credited them for until we started doing research. But their level of ability for problem solving and thinking is well below anything that humans can achieve. So it's the level of cognition, the level of ability to think and to override. So I would simplistically categorize our midbrain functions are those that we share with reptiles and all kinds of other organisms. And part of the function there is that the autonomic system, where your heart keeps beating, your lungs the diaphragm keeps going up and down, and your lungs keep taking in and expelling air. All of those functions are midbrain functions. But so are your emotions, fears, anxieties, propensities to cooperate. Those are all midbrain function, to be xenophobic. And they all evolved as ways of enhancing the survival of that particular group of organisms. Cognition came along much later, and even in lower organisms that have some cognitive capacity, enables them to make decisions that are not in accordance with what their midbrain would naturally have them do, their impulses, their propensities. In humans, this is at a very high level. So we can decide on actions that otherwise our midbrain would just tell us to do. So fight or flight is a classic example that people use. We have an impulse to quickly decide to run or to put up a struggle. Cognition, I suppose if the time frame's short enough, you're just going to do what you do. But if you have any time at all for cognitive reflection, you can override your immediate impulse to fight and decide to just walk away or run away because you know on balance you're going to do better by just ending this and letting the other person have some kind of victory rather than trying to fight it out. And that's the role of cognition that I see playing out most in my view. There are lots of other roles for cognition. Our whole scientific edifice is based on our cognitive capacities to reason and to think, to rule things out, to logically deduce one thing from another, our whole mathematical edifice. So it does a lot more than that. But in my view of morality, it plays the role of mediating and overriding or encouraging what our midbrain impulses would have us do.
Mm-hmm. Talking about copulatory choices now, why is it so common that societies encroach on the individual, on the copulatory choices of individuals? I mean, why should it matter to people why other people in their own societies, I mean, who they copulate with and things like that?
Well, I think the answer lies in the possible story about the origin of it. And I'm not sure we know enough about the history of the development of trying to regulate copulatory behavior. But for sure, some of the key elements keep emerging as people do investigations. And one has to do in some of the earliest times with the protection of one's mate, the securing and then maintaining of a relationship. It's a whole lot easier if you can get other people to agree that, yeah, you own this mate, or only you are going to have copulatory behavior with this person. And you begin to write rules that codify that in some way or another. It begins to be more perhaps important when you have at stake economic interests. So a lot of the rules and regulations came about in what I call the elite structures of societies as they develop. So let's take the last couple of thousand years. And the elite in those societies was a great deal at stake in terms of who got this daughter, which noble, which king, which whatever. And so a whole aura of rules and regulations protecting, and it is a notion of property. So it goes back to patriarchy, protecting the property and the value of that particular property. And you want to know the lineage because lineage is important if you're in the elite. I think if you look at poor people, common people, I'm not keen on that word, but since I'm just describing now two classes, and I think societies have so many stratifications, this is very simplistic, but there's the elite, about whom we know a lot, because they wrote the books, they ruled the societies, they ran the parliaments. The poor just tried to stay alive. And for most of them, they didn't have multi-room houses. They had single-room houses. And so the story is very different about the development of patterns of copulatory behavior. And you can see that it's much looser in common society than it is in the elite society. But the elite society wrote the rules, and they applied. And one of the ways of writing the rules was through religion. And that's one of the ideological things that language made possible too, because you could tell stories and develop founding mythologies. So the overall thrust of the development of copulatory restrictions came from the elite protecting their economic interests, their lineages, from dilution or from loss of control of what was going on. And those rules, once promulgated, especially through religious ideas, began to be imposed on everybody. But when you take a look at the common class of people, you'll find that brothels they were among the elite too, but they were kept very quiet there. But brothels were much more openly known about. It wasn't uncommon for people to be seen naked, certainly within a household. It wasn't uncommon for children to see their parents in copulatory behavior because there was often just a single space in which they all lived. It wasn't uncommon to engage in sexual activity with prostitutes, with other people's daughters. The literature that we have, which is sparse because the poor people didn't write literature and they didn't pass on many tales, but there you see the rules basically as rules of imposition that arose from the dynamics of the elite and the economic social interests. I think in modern society, just as one last comment on that, there's another layer that's developed, and that is there was really no meaningful sense of childhood until about 200 years ago, maybe three. And now there's a great deal of interest in the protection of children and childhood. And there's worries about, if children, an 8-year-old sees somebody copulating, is this going to damage them, or see them naked even? Is that going to damage them? All the literature suggests no, but all the common perceptions argue yes. I mean, people just believe it will. And they don't want it to happen. They don't want their male child to see a bare-breasted female. Don't know exactly what they think the evidence is that this would damage them. But now childhood goes on to, 15, 16, and there is a sense of vulnerability that comes with our notion of childhood. So people are vulnerable, and I believe this is true. but they were vulnerable 400 years ago too. They're more vulnerable when they're in that whatever time frame you give it of childhood, and therefore they need protection. And being paternalistic is probably a good thing. So you write rules around that. Those I think are going to be more complex to dismantle. But I would like to see a dismantling of a lot of the rules and regulations that came from the economic protection of the elite and the lineage protection of the elite.
Does the number of offspring individuals have a matter?
Yes, it doesn't perhaps matter to the individual, and I wouldn't suggest that it should matter to the individual. In fact, I hope I go to great lengths to try to say that maximizing the evolutionary reproductive success does not mean that people have an obligation to reproduce or to behave in those ways. So I think from an individual point of view, some individuals could see it as a great advantage not to have any children. I actually know people who have made a conscious decision not to have children. I mean, some because they're very concerned about overpopulation, some because they just don't think that they would do a good job of parenting, and some they just too many other things that they'd like to achieve in life. So the answer on that level is no. People don't have to, and they often don't benefit themselves, or at least see a benefit in reproducing. But the concept of morality that I'm developing is much more of a species or population level concept. And so at the population level, if people didn't reproduce, then, or certain kinds of people decided not to reproduce, it will change the nature of the species in ways that are not necessarily evolutionarily advantageous, and therefore not advantageous to the species. And to just underscore why this is more population level, in a paper that I wrote a long time ago, which now I would say has lots of flaws, but I probably will say that about this book in another 10 years as well. And it was on the biology of evil, the evolutionary biology of evil. And there I quite clearly make the notion of evil or bad behavior, such as people who are free riders. That behavior is destabilizing of the society, destabilizing of the population, and is therefore bad. But it's not bad because it's bad for that person. And it may not even be bad for a particular individual that you can pick out. But overall, in the longer term, it's bad for that population. So I put morality as a population level issue. And the question of how individuals themselves believe they're going to benefit or not benefit is independent of that. It's not divorced from it, but they can make their decisions independently. But if collectively they all make the decision not to reproduce, that the effects of that is the destabilization or elimination in the long term of that population.
Do you think that there are any situations where social intervention and even social coercion might be justified?
Those cases where you're ensuring that everybody is enjoying the same maximization of evolutionary reproductive success, or enjoying, if you grant me that I've been able to get inclusiveness and liberty and equality out from this theory of morality, then people who are undermining other people's liberty, behaviors that are known to enhance one person's liberty at the expense of others. I think there's a role for social intervention and coercing somebody not to do it. I think abusers, people who take advantage of the system for their own ends without regard for others, are an extreme case of that. And definitely the society has a role in coercing them out of that behavior or coercing them from the society, just eliminating them. And prisons are our current way of doing that, but one time they sent people to Von Diemen's Land, Australia, and down in that part of the world. But today we use prisons. We try rehabilitation, and that seems to me to be correct, but we go back and forth on whether we're very successful in a large number of cases. So I believe, yes, there's a role for coercion, but only in setting up the society. Let me try to crystallize this a little bit. The Supreme Court of Canada, a number of years ago, probably 20 years ago now, ruled on a case of a swingers club in Montreal, Canada. A swingers club, for those of your listeners who I doubt there are very many in this category, those who don't know what swingers clubs are, is a place where people buy a membership and they go in and they have public sex or switching partners and so on. They do this completely of their own free will, at least as best one can determine. So the police typically at that time were just turning a blind eye unless they got a complaint. Well, if they got a complaint, it was technically deemed illegal and they had to act. And they did get a complaint about a person, LeBay, who was running several swingers clubs in Montreal. So it ended up in the Supreme Court of Canada. And they used effectively, they used John Stuart Mill's principle of harm. They didn't explicitly mention Mill, but they had a two-pronged test for whether something was indecent and could be prohibited. And one was whether it brought harm to the individuals involved that they could not have known about or consented to. And they went through all the possible cases that people ream off about the harms of being swingers and so on. And one of them, obviously, is sexually transmitted disease. But their view was, well, yes, that's true, but that's true of anyone who has promiscuous habits. Maybe true of people who have even less promiscuous habits than some. And therefore, this doesn't put this in a special class by itself. And then the second harm is the harm to society. Does this harm the society? Well, I, along with one of my philosophical colleagues at the University of Toronto, want to know who's harmed. This amorphous society is a bit hard to nail down. Specifically, who is harmed? The Supreme Court didn't worry about that. They just said harm to society, like the undermining of social values or confidence or something. But they set a second prong, which was a test that said that the harm has to rise to the level where it interferes with the proper functioning of a society. And I think that's the right level for the intervention of the state, that it has to demonstrate that it is either protecting some individual and clearly show that they're protecting that individual, or they're protecting the functioning of the society, but they have to then demonstrate that this is going to destabilize the society.
Right. So just talking about another issue that you cover in the book, why should we care about issues regarding overpopulation and extinction?
I guess the answer begins by pointing out that in many species, there are built-in population controls. So there are many birds, for example, that when the population density reaches a certain point, fertility levels go down. It's a purely biological mechanism, but it's evolved because overpopulation is bad for everybody. It's like a story I heard many years ago about Everest, and when there were half a dozen people a year climbing Everest, and they tossed their aluminum cans to the side and they left their garbage all over the place, it really didn't matter all that much because eventually it would rust and decay and so on. It would oxidize in some way and go back into the environment. Now, plastic bags may be an exception, but even they kind of get scattered and they're just bits of polyethylene floating around. But when you start having 5,000 people every month climbing Everest and tossing all their stuff, then you've got a problem, an environmental problem. And Everest is going to, the mountain itself is going to end up having some consequences from that. So as long as there are small numbers in a population, there's food resource compatibility. There's lots for people to eat or forage for or hunt. But once you start to get high levels of population, you begin to, I didn't say it this way in the book, but I would say you begin to destabilize the social structure. And I would broaden it now to say you begin to destabilize multiple social structures if you begin overpopulation on the level we are now. At the United Nations, it's estimated we've just reached 8 billion people on the planet. Yeah. A lot of people. Now, to go back to your extinction point, so that frames the issue that overpopulation is a destabilizing factor. But species come and go. They go extinct. They didn't manage to be able to track the environmental changes successfully enough. One contrasting example that shows this in the case of hominids is Neanderthals didn't make it. They existed at the same time as Homo sapiens, but the ice ages were brutal on them. They couldn't adapt. Whereas Homo sapiens, they managed to find a thing called clothing, and they managed to harness fire better than Neanderthals did. And so the Neanderthals kept moving south as a response to the encroaching coldness. And eventually they got to southern Spain and places like that. And there was very few other places now to go. In small numbers, they did make it across the Mediterranean and so on. But by and large, they were trapped in. And they died out. They became extinct because they couldn't move quickly enough with the environmental change. It's another case where cognition helped us because we were able to think about a solution that was cultural. We probably have now overdone the clothing side of things, and it's become an economic, commercially fashion-driven issue. But in that time, it saved us as Homo sapiens.
Right.
Overpopulation is going to put pressure on us that we are not going to be able to evolve quickly enough to resolve in terms of our genetics. So we're going to have a cultural solution to it. And to the extent we can't find one, and it looks like we're not doing very well at finding one, we could become extinct. And extinction may not sound like such a bad thing, since everything becomes extinct. Every organism we know becomes extinct at some point, but we'll become extinct faster. And I don't find that a particularly appealing end. And that may just be a personal predilection of mine, but I think it's probably shared by lots of other people. But we may be beyond the point of recovery. And climate change is in part a function of population increase. We've chopped down a lot of trees in North America, at least. I'm trying hard not to let it happen in South America, but I understand why they're a bit ticked off that in North America we did it, became economically successful because of it, and now we're telling them, well, no, you can't cut down yours too. Right. I understand the dilemmas across parts of the world, but it's because of population levels that we are doing some of the things that we're doing, and the extent to which we continue to burn fossil fuels, not just that we do, but the amount that we burn is related to the number of people that need to use fossil fuels, or at least believe they need to use fossil fuels. In some cases do. So I find the argument of extinction a powerful one for trying to come to grips with our current mess. But I don't know that I could claim that this is directly attackable by my theory of morality.
Mm-hmm. I have one final question then. Do you think that tackling human morality from an evolutionary perspective would commit us to any sort of meta-ethical stance, like, for example, moral anti-realism, like moral nihilism or moral relativism, for example?
I don't think it leads to relativism because I claim this is true for the entire planet, that this is the basis for human morality wherever you are, and that cultures may tweak it a bit here and there. So you will have cultural differences in the expression, but the actual fundamental values are values for all Homo sapiens. It's just the way in which we have evolved that particular set of propensities and ways of functioning. Metaethics is hard. So, is it a moral anti-realism? Well, there are a lot of different versions of moral anti-realism, and I don't think it's any of those, and I'll tell you what I do think in a minute, but let me just run through the sort of main three that most of the time get mentioned. So one is non-cognitivism. Just to explain that, it means that moral claims can't be true or false. There's nothing against which to measure their truth or falsity. If I say that I have a pile of wood in my backyard, we can go out and take a look, and if there's a pile of wood there, then I was telling the truth, and if there isn't, I wasn't. It's false. The non-cognitivist views that are anti-realist say, well, morality is not like that anyway. There aren't truths and falsehoods. Morality is more like persuasion, that, I like things this way, and you should too, and I try to persuade you as to why they should be that way. So it's kind of a command, do this, not because it's right or wrong, but because, just do it. This is the way we do things around here. My view is not non-cognitivist, because I believe there is empirical things that you can use, and we've gone through a number of them in this discussion. There are empirical things that make the claims true or false. I mean, there could be new information from an evolutionary point of view that would make things I say in my book wrong. And I've got a lot of biological references in the book because I want it to be based on the best empirical evidence we have, which may turn out to be contradicted at some point in the future. So there is a way of determining the truth or falsity. It's not an error theory of the kind that J.L. Mackie had, where, we actually do make true and false claims in making moral claims, because we believe we're playing that kind of a game, and that there is something true or false about those claims, but we're just in error. We're just mistaken to believe there's anything empirical that could ground them, and there certainly is no other realm where you could ground moral views. There's not sort of a world of morality that can be explored the way we can explore the empirical world. So I'm not, I wouldn't be an anti-realist in that sense. And then there's just the subjectivism, or what some people call non-objectivism, where it's all kind of subjective, but we understand that we need to do this in order to enable our societies to function and able to let people know what they should be doing. So none of those would capture what I'm doing. So I would say I'm not an anti-realist, I'm not a relativist, but I am a moral naturalist in the sense that I believe that morality is an empirical enterprise, and determining what is morally correct and not correct is an empirical enterprise. And that's what I've tried to do in the book. So the ultimate goal of the book was to try to establish that Morality can be based on evolution, and evolution is an empirical field of investigation. And we either have that field of investigation sufficiently under control that my arguments will work, or we don't, in which case it may be sometime in the future that people will laugh and say, well, they thought that that was the case in the past. Or it could be the case that we continue to hold the same empirical views that we currently hold, but clever people come along, or maybe not so clever, come along and show that, well, yeah, the empirical evidence is clear, but your reasoning from it is false. And therefore, your theory of morality, your contractualist theory of morality simply won't work. I'm prepared for both of those to happen. But what that says is that it is disprovable, or it is sustainable. I wouldn't say ever provable, but it's sustainable over the long haul if the empirical evidence continues to go the way it has in the past, and if I have correctly derived morality from it.
Great. So the book is again Evolution, Morality, and the Fabric of Society. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Thompson, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. And it's been a fascinating conversation, and the book is a great read. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the interview. Thank you for that last comment. And I've enjoyed it thoroughly. So I wish you success on your future podcasts.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Ricalania, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodrenko, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Haslem Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T., Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Antonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yagi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sonny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luis Caetano, Tom Wagner, Dan Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.